The dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Montana stretched endlessly under the scorching 1887 sun, where secrets buried deeper than gold mines were about to surface in ways nobody could predict. Sarah McKenna had spent 3 years convincing everyone she belonged to no one, but one cowboy was about to challenge everything she believed about freedom, loyalty, and the dangerous game she'd been playing with her own identity. Sarah's boots clicked against the weathered wooden planks of the general store porch as she adjusted the wide brim of her hat, casting shadows across features that seemed too refined for frontier life. The town folk of Copper Ridge had grown accustomed to her independence, the way she handled business transactions with the confidence of a seasoned rancher, yet nobody questioned why a woman of barely 25 possessed such knowledge of cattle prices and land deeds. She preferred it that way. Questions led to answers, and answers led to truths she wasn't ready to reveal. The morning had started like any other until Jack Morrison rode into town. His horse kicked up clouds of red dirt as he approached the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon, his presence commanding attention without effort. Jack wasn't just another drifter passing through Montana territory. His reputation preceded him. A man who could track anyone across 3 states, who never left a job unfinished, and whose steel-gray eyes seemed to see through whatever mask a person chose to wear. Sarah watched from her position across the street, instinctively stepping back into the shadows of the mercantile's overhang. Something about the way Jack carried himself, the methodical way he surveyed the town, sent warning bells clanging in her mind. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men her father had hired to hunt down cattle thieves and claim jumpers back in Texas. This wasn't a casual visit. Inside Murphy's saloon, conversations died as Jack pushed through the batwing doors. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who'd served drinks in Copper Ridge for 15 years, barely looked up from the glass he was cleaning. In frontier towns, strangers were common, but smart bartenders learned to read the difference between travelers seeking shelter and men seeking something else entirely. Jack ordered whiskey and let his gaze sweep the room with practiced efficiency. 3 card players at a corner table, 2 ranch hands arguing over a woman named Dolly, and an old-timer nursing his 3rd beer of the morning. Nothing unusual except for the photograph he pulled from his vest pocket and placed carefully on the bar. The sepia image showed a young woman with familiar features, though her hair was longer and her dress spoke of wealth and privilege. Pete's hand stilled on the glass. He'd seen that face before, though not in the context of silk dresses and pearl necklaces. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to someone who frequented his establishment, someone who dressed in practical riding clothes and paid for her drinks with coins earned from honest work. Meanwhile, Sarah had positioned herself near the window of Henderson's drugstore, using the reflection in the glass to monitor Jack's movements. Her heart raced as she recognized the methodical pattern of his behavior. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had sent him, and given the timing of his arrival just days after the 3rd anniversary of her departure from Dallas, she could guess who that someone might be. The mystery deepened when Doc Brennan approached her, his weathered face creased with concern. As the town's physician and unofficial keeper of secrets, Doc had treated Sarah for various minor ailments over the years, always respecting her request for privacy. Today, however, his usual jovial demeanor was replaced by something that looked suspiciously like worry. "Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "there's something you need to know. That stranger asking questions about town isn't just passing through. He's got a photograph, and he's been showing it to folks, asking if they've seen the woman in the picture." Sarah's blood turned cold. She'd been so careful, creating an entirely new identity when she'd fled Texas 3 years ago. The transformation from Sarah Elizabeth Worthington, daughter of one of Dallas's most prominent cattle barons, to Sarah McKenna, independent ranch hand and occasional seamstress, had required meticulous planning and considerable sacrifice. She'd left behind not just wealth and privilege, but also the only life she'd ever known. The reason for her flight was buried in family secrets darker than any frontier night. Her father, Samuel Worthington, had built his cattle empire through methods that wouldn't bear close scrutiny. When Sarah had discovered the truth about his business partnerships and the violence used to secure land deals, she'd faced an impossible choice: remain silent and complicit, or risk everything by walking away. She'd chosen the latter, but not before gathering evidence that could destroy her father's reputation and business empire. That evidence was hidden somewhere only she knew, and its discovery would explain why someone had finally tracked her to this remote Montana town. Jack Morrison had accepted the job of finding Sarah Worthington for reasons that extended beyond the substantial fee offered by her father. 3 years ago, his younger brother Thomas had been killed during a confrontation over disputed grazing rights near Dallas. The official story claimed Thomas had been caught stealing cattle, but Jack had never believed that version of events. His investigation had led him to connections with the Worthington Ranch, and finding Samuel's missing daughter might provide answers he'd been seeking about Thomas's death. As afternoon shadows grew longer, the inevitable confrontation approached. Sarah knew she couldn't avoid Jack indefinitely in a town the size of Copper Ridge. Her options were limited: flee again and spend the rest of her life running, or face whatever consequences awaited her return to Texas. Neither choice appealed to her, but a third option was forming in her mind, one that would require considerable courage and perfect timing. The opportunity came when Jack entered the boarding house where Sarah had been renting a room for the past 2 years. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly proprietor, was known for her discretion, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her voice when she knocked on Sarah's door to announce her visitor. "Miss McKenna," she called softly, "there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Jack Morrison, and he has business to discuss." Sarah took a deep breath, checked the small derringer she kept hidden in her boot, and opened the door. The hallway seemed to shrink as Jack filled the space with his presence. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he cataloged details about her appearance and surroundings. This was a man who missed nothing, which made her deception all the more dangerous. "Miss McKenna," Jack said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but not deferential. "I believe we have matters to discuss." "I can't imagine what business you might have with me, Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Jack's smile was thin and humorless. "I think you can, Miss Worthington." The use of her real name hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble, but she wasn't ready to surrender without a fight. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else," she said, though they both knew the pretense was pointless. "Your father is worried about you," Jack continued, ignoring her denial. "He's been searching for 3 years. He wants you to come home." "My father," Sarah said with bitter emphasis, "stopped being concerned about my welfare the day he chose money over justice." The admission surprised Jack. He'd expected denial, tears, perhaps even an attempt to flee. He hadn't anticipated this calm acknowledgement of family conflict. It suggested depths to the situation that his employer hadn't revealed. "Whatever disagreement you had with your father can be resolved," Jack said. "Running away solved nothing." "Running away saved my soul," Sarah countered. "Do you know what kind of man Samuel Worthington really is? Do you know how he built his empire?" Jack's expression shifted slightly. Here was the opening he'd been hoping for, the connection to his brother's death that had driven him to accept this assignment. "Tell me," he said simply. Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign that this might be a trap. Something in his tone suggested genuine interest rather than mere professional obligation. She made a decision that would change both their lives. 3 years ago, I discovered documents in my father's study that detailed illegal land acquisitions, intimidation of competing ranchers, and worse. Men who refused to sell their property to him had a tendency to meet with unfortunate accidents. When I confronted him about it, he told me I could either accept the family business as it was, or find myself cut off from everything I'd ever known. Jack's hands clenched involuntarily. "Did those documents mention a man named Thomas Morrison?" Sarah's eyes widened. The name was familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. Then memory provided the connection, and her face paled. "You're his brother," she whispered. "Thomas Morrison was your brother. He was killed on land my father wanted to buy. The official story claimed he was stealing cattle, but that was a lie. Thomas was investigating suspicious activities in the area when he was murdered. The revelation hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Sarah's flight from her father's corruption and Jack's quest for justice regarding his brother's death were connected in ways that transformed their confrontation into something entirely different. "I can prove what happened to your brother," Sarah said quietly. "The evidence I gathered before I left Dallas includes records of that land deal and the methods used to secure it. But revealing that information will destroy more than just my father's reputation. It will implicate other powerful men. Men who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens them." Jack's expression hardened. "Let me worry about the consequences. Where is this evidence?" Sarah hesitated. Once she revealed the location of her hidden documents, she would lose the only leverage she possessed against her father's attempts to force her return. But looking into Jack's eyes, she saw something that reminded her of her own desperate flight from injustice 3 years ago. "It's hidden in a safety deposit box in Denver," she said. "I've been paying the rental fee through a bank in Billings under an assumed name. The key is sewn into the lining of my riding jacket." "Then we have a problem," Jack said. "Your father hired me to bring you back to Dallas, not to help you expose his crimes. But I can't ignore evidence that might finally give me justice for Thomas." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do you fulfill your contract and drag me back to Texas? Or do you help me bring the truth to light?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that would determine not just their immediate futures, but the fate of everyone connected to Samuel Worthington's criminal enterprise. "There's a third option," he said finally. "We retrieve that evidence together, but we don't return to Dallas. We take it to the federal marshal in Helena. Let the law handle your father and his associates." "And then?" Sarah asked. "Then you decide whether you want to keep running, or whether you're ready to stop pretending you belong to no one." The words carried implications that went beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah had spent 3 years convincing herself that independence meant isolation, that safety required severing all meaningful connections. But Jack's presence had awakened something she'd thought she'd successfully buried, the desire to trust someone, to share the burden of truth she'd been carrying alone. "If we do this," Sarah said, "there's no going back. Once we expose what my father has done, we'll both be targets. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been a target since the day I started asking questions about Thomas's death," Jack replied. "At least this way I won't be fighting alone." The decision made, they began planning their journey to Denver. It would require careful timing and considerable caution, as Sarah's father would likely have other men searching for her. And their departure from Copper Ridge wouldn't go unnoticed in a town where strangers and sudden travel attracted attention. Doc Brennan proved unexpectedly helpful, providing medical supplies and a cover story about Sarah needing specialized treatment available only in Denver. Mrs. Patterson, who had grown fond of her long-term boarder, offered to spread word that Sarah had accepted a position as a governess for a family in Colorado, explaining her sudden departure. The journey to Denver took 4 days, during which Sarah and Jack shared stories that revealed the depth of corruption they were attempting to expose. Sarah's evidence included not just documents related to Thomas's death, but proof of a network of illegal activities spanning multiple states and involving prominent businessmen and corrupt officials. In Denver, they discovered that Sarah's precautions had been wise but insufficient. The safety deposit box had been accessed 2 days earlier by men claiming to represent Sarah's interests. The evidence she'd risked everything to preserve was gone. "How did they find it?" Sarah asked, devastation clear in her voice. Jack's expression was grim. "Your father has resources you probably underestimated. He's had 3 years to track your movements, identify your aliases, and monitor your financial activities." The loss of the physical evidence seemed to end their hopes of achieving justice, but Jack wasn't ready to surrender. Years of tracking fugitives had taught him that evidence existed in multiple forms, and determined investigators could often reconstruct what others thought they'd successfully destroyed. "Did you ever make copies of those documents?" he asked. "Some of them," Sarah admitted. "I hid duplicates in 3 different locations before I left Texas, but I assumed the original documents would be safer in Denver." "Where are the copies?" "One set is hidden in a church in Fort Worth. Another in an abandoned line shack on land that used to belong to Thomas's family, And the third. She hesitated. Where, Sarah? In my mother's grave, she said quietly. Wrapped in oilcloth and buried with her jewelry box. It seemed like the one place my father would never think to look. The revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. Retrieving evidence from a grave would require returning to Dallas, the very place Sarah had fled and where her father's influence was strongest. It would also mean confronting memories she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. We don't have to do this, Jack said, recognizing her distress. Living with injustice is better than dying for justice. No, Sarah said with renewed determination. I've been running from my father's sins for 3 years, but I realize now that hiding from evil is just another form of complicity. If we're going to stop him, we need that evidence. The return journey to Texas tested both their resolve and their growing trust in each other. Sarah's transformation back into her original identity required not just changing clothes, but readopting mannerisms and speech patterns she'd deliberately abandoned. Jack struggled with the knowledge that he was essentially delivering his employer's daughter back to him, albeit under very different circumstances than originally intended. Their arrival in Dallas was carefully orchestrated. While Sarah visited her mother's grave under cover of darkness, Jack established contact with a federal marshal who had been investigating reports of corruption in the cattle industry. The marshal, William Hayes, had been building a case against several prominent ranchers for months, but had lacked the concrete evidence needed to bring charges. The documents Sarah retrieved from her mother's grave provided that missing evidence and more. Her father's meticulous record-keeping, intended to protect him from prosecution by documenting his associates' complicity, instead created a detailed map of criminal activity that implicated dozens of powerful men. Marshal Hayes moved quickly once he reviewed the evidence. Simultaneous raids were conducted on multiple properties, and arrests were made before the targets could flee or destroy additional evidence. Samuel Worthington was taken into custody at his ranch. His expression of shock and betrayal when he saw Sarah standing beside the marshal providing a moment of satisfaction that 3 years of exile had been worth. The trial that followed exposed corruption that reached far beyond the cattle industry. Samuel Worthington's empire crumbled as former associates testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences. Justice for Thomas Morrison and dozens of other victims finally arrived, though it came at a cost that both Sarah and Jack felt deeply. Sarah's testimony against her father severed their relationship permanently. The man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride and shoot and manage business affairs, became a stranger whose love had always been conditional on her silence about his crimes. The wealth and social position she'd inherited as his daughter disappeared with his conviction, leaving her truly independent for the first time in her life. Jack's quest for justice had been achieved, but victory felt hollow without Thomas there to share it. The money Samuel Worthington had paid him to find Sarah was donated to families affected by the corruption he'd helped expose, a gesture that felt necessary but insufficient. In the aftermath of the trial, as Dallas society adjusted to the absence of the powerful men who had shaped its development through illegal means, Sarah and Jack found themselves facing decisions about their own futures. The bonds forged during their dangerous journey to expose the truth had evolved into something deeper than partnership in pursuit of justice. You know, Jack said as they stood outside the courthouse after the final sentencing, you never did give me a straight answer about whether you belong to someone or not. Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd worn in years. I've learned something about belonging, she said. It's not about ownership or control or even protection. It's about choice. And I choose to belong with you if you'll have me. I thought you'd never ask, Jack replied, pulling her into his arms as the Texas sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the promise of their uncertain but hopeful future. The dusty streets of Dallas stretched before them, no longer representing the corruption and injustice that had driven Sarah away, but the possibility of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. They had faced the truth together, survived the consequences of speaking it, and discovered that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is refusing to let evil triumph through silence. Their story would be remembered in the frontier towns where such tales were currency, passed down through generations as an example of how ordinary people could stand against powerful corruption and prevail. But for Sarah and Jack, The real victory was simpler and more personal. They had found each other in the midst of seeking justice and discovered that belonging to someone could be an act of freedom rather than surrender. The cowboy had asked his question and received his answer. She was his and he was hers, not through possession or dominance, but through the choice to face whatever came next together. In the end, that choice proved stronger than any chain, more valuable than any treasure, and more lasting than any empire built on lies and violence. As they rode away from Dallas toward a future they would write together, the setting sun cast long shadows behind them, symbolically burying the past while illuminating the road ahead. The Old West was changing, slowly becoming less wild and more civilized. But for those brave enough to fight for what was right, it would always represent the possibility of justice and the chance for redemption. Western drama script, 10-minute ending. The months that followed brought changes neither Sarah nor Jack could have anticipated when they first faced each other in that boarding house hallway in Copper Ridge. The federal investigation sparked by Sarah's evidence had ripple effects across the entire Southwest, exposing a network of corruption that reached from Texas ranches to railroad companies, from territorial governors to federal land office officials. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had become a catalyst for reform that would reshape the frontier for decades to come. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of being both celebrated and vilified by different segments of society. Eastern newspapers praised her courage in exposing her father's crimes, portraying her as a symbol of the new American woman willing to sacrifice privilege for principle. But in Texas, where the Worthington name had carried weight for generations, she was seen by many as a traitor who had destroyed not just her father, but dozens of families whose livelihoods had depended on the businesses built through corrupt means. The weight of these consequences tested Sarah's resolve during the long winter they spent in a small cabin outside Billings, Montana. Jack had purchased the property with money earned from years of bounty hunting, intending it as a temporary refuge while they decided their next steps. But as snow blanketed the landscape and isolated them from the outside world, the cabin became a sanctuary where they could finally process everything that had happened. Jack watched Sarah struggle with guilt over the unintended victims of their crusade for justice. Ranch hands who had lost their jobs when corrupt operations were shut down, shopkeepers whose businesses failed when their wealthy customers were imprisoned, even the wives and children of the convicted men who bore no responsibility for their husbands' and fathers' crimes. The moral complexity of their victory weighed heavily on her conscience. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing," Sarah confessed one evening as they sat by the fireplace, watching snow fall outside their window. "So many innocent people have been hurt because of what we exposed." Jack set down the leather harness he'd been repairing and moved to sit beside her. "The innocent people were already being hurt," he said gently. "They just didn't know it. Every family forced off their land, every honest rancher driven out of business, every man like Thomas who died for asking questions. They were all victims of the same system we brought down. But now those victims have names and faces I can see in the newspapers," Sarah replied. "It's easier to live with abstract injustice than with the specific consequences of your choices." This internal struggle represented the final transformation Sarah needed to undergo. She had evolved from a sheltered daughter of privilege to an independent frontier woman, and then to a crusader for justice. Now she had to learn to live with the complex legacy of her choices, accepting that doing right often came with a price that extended beyond the wrongdoers themselves. The resolution came in an unexpected form during a March blizzard that lasted 3 days. Trapped in the cabin with no contact with the outside world, Sarah and Jack were forced to rely entirely on each other for survival and companionship. The isolation stripped away the last pretenses between them, revealing truths they hadn't yet spoken aloud. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said on the second night of the storm, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "When I first realized you'd been sent to find me, I considered killing you." Jack's hand stilled on the coffee cup he'd been holding. "What stopped you?" "Your eyes," she said simply. "They reminded me of Thomas's eyes in the photograph I'd seen in my father's files. I realized you weren't just another hired gun. You were someone seeking justice for someone you loved." The admission opened a floodgate of honesty between them. Jack revealed his own moments of doubt, times when he'd questioned whether revenge for his brother's death was worth the destruction they were causing. Sarah spoke about the nightmares that still plagued her, dreams where her father's victims thanked her and condemned her in the same breath. But most importantly, they talked about their future together. The romance that had grown between them during their dangerous journey had been built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Now they had to discover whether their connection could survive in a world where their mission was complete and they were free to choose their own path. "What do you want, Sarah?" Jack asked as the storm began to subside on the third day. "Not what you think you should want, or what would make up for past mistakes, but what would make you happy." Sarah was quiet for a long time before answering. "I want to build something," she said finally. "Not tear down or expose or fight against, but create something good that didn't exist before. I'm tired of defining myself by what I'm running from or fighting against." "What kind of something?" Jack pressed. "A school, maybe, or a hospital. Somewhere out here where people need help but can't afford to pay for it. I have skills from my privileged upbringing that could be useful if applied to helping people instead of maintaining social status." Jack smiled, recognizing the woman he'd fallen in love with in this vision of constructive purpose. "That sounds like something worth doing. Where would you want to build this something?" "Somewhere new," Sarah said. "Not Montana, where people know me as the woman who hid her identity, and not Texas, where I'll always be Samuel Worthington's daughter. Somewhere I can just be Sarah, helping people who need help." The conversation led to research into territories where their skills and resources could make the biggest difference. They eventually settled on New Mexico territory, where rapid growth from mining and railroad development had created communities with urgent needs for education and medical care, but little infrastructure to provide them. By spring, they had developed a plan to establish a combination school and medical clinic in a growing town called Silver Creek, about 50 miles north of Santa Fe. Sarah would use her education and social skills to teach children and adults, while Jack would provide security and handle the practical aspects of running their operation. They would fund the venture through the reward money Jack had earned for his role in exposing the corruption network, creating something positive from the destruction of the past. The journey south to New Mexico represented more than just a change of location. It was Sarah's final break with her old identity and Jack's transformation from a man driven by vengeance to someone motivated by hope. They traveled as equals, partners in every sense, having learned that true belonging meant choosing to share your life with someone rather than being owned by them or owning them in return. Their arrival in Silver Creek coincided with the town's annual Founders' Day celebration, a fitting symbol of new beginnings. The community welcomed them warmly, eager for the services they offered and uninterested in their complicated past. Here, they were simply Jack and Sarah Morrison, a married couple dedicated to helping their neighbors build a better future. The school they established became known throughout the territory for its innovative approach to education, teaching practical skills alongside traditional subjects and welcoming students regardless of their ability to pay. The medical clinic treated everyone from wealthy mine owners to impoverished Mexican families, establishing a reputation for competence and compassion that drew patients from hundreds of miles away. But perhaps their greatest success was personal. The partnership that had begun with mutual suspicion and conflicting purposes evolved into a marriage built on shared values and complementary strengths. They had learned to balance Sarah's idealistic vision with Jack's practical experience, creating something neither could have achieved alone. 5 years after their first confrontation in Copper Ridge, Sarah stood on the porch of their home in Silver Creek, watching Jack teach a group of local boys how to handle horses safely. The scene represented everything they had fought to achieve. A community built on honesty rather than corruption, relationships based on mutual respect rather than power, and a future defined by hope rather than fear. The letter she held in her hand brought news from Dallas. Her father had died in prison, his empire permanently dismantled and his name synonymous with the corruption that had once seemed so powerful. The notice of his death stirred complex emotions, but Sarah felt no regret about the choices that had led to this moment. Justice had been served, not just for Thomas Morrison and the other victims, but for the ideal that no one should be above the law regardless of their wealth or influence. Jack joined her on the porch as the sun began to set behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Any regrets? He asked, following her gaze toward the horizon. Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the security that came from being truly known and accepted by another person. None, she said with certainty. We chose each other, we chose justice, and we chose to build rather than destroy. I can't think of a better way to have lived these years. And the future? Jack asked, his arm tightening around her waist. We keep building, Sarah replied. Keep teaching, keep healing, keep showing people that it's possible to create something good from the ashes of something corrupt. We belong to each other and to this community and to the idea that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose to stand up for what's right. As darkness fell over Silver Creek, the lights in their school and clinic glowed warmly, beacons of hope in a landscape that had seen too much violence and injustice. The cowboy had asked his question years ago in a dusty Montana town, demanding to know whether she belonged to someone or no one. Sarah had given her answer not in words, but in choices that had shaped both their lives and the lives of countless others. She belonged to Jack and he to her, but their belonging was the kind that made them both stronger and freer rather than weaker and more constrained. They had learned that the deepest kind of love doesn't seek to possess or control, but to support and encourage the best in another person. In choosing each other, they had chosen to become better versions of themselves. The Old West was changing around them, becoming more civilized and less wild with each passing year. But in places like Silver Creek, where people like Jack and Sarah Morrison worked to build communities based on justice and compassion, the frontier spirit lived on in its best form. The belief that individuals could make a difference, that right would ultimately triumph over wrong, and that love freely given was stronger than any force that sought to divide or destroy. Their story would be remembered not as a tale of revenge or rebellion, but as an example of how two people could find each other in the midst of seeking justice and discover that the greatest victory was not defeating their enemies, but building something better than what had existed before. In the end, that lesson proved more valuable than any treasure and more lasting than any empire built on lies.